Sarah Chen was 11 years old when her family moved from a small town in Ohio to the wealthy suburb of Westfield, New Jersey. Her father had taken a job at a local accounting firm, and her mother worked part-time at a grocery store. They rented a modest house on the edge of the neighborhood, where the lawns were smaller and the cars were older than the ones parked in the driveways just 2 streets over. Sarah noticed these differences right away. Kids always do. Starting at Westfield Middle School in the middle of the school year was hard enough on its own. But Sarah carried something extra with her, something that made fitting in even more difficult. She was quiet. She kept her eyes down in the hallways. She wore clothes that were clean and neat, but not the kind that came with brand names or designer labels. In a school where social status was something kids took seriously even at that age, Sarah stood out for all the wrong reasons. The first few weeks passed slowly. She ate lunch alone or sat at the edge of tables where no one spoke to her directly. She was not disliked in a cruel or obvious way, at least not at first. She was simply invisible, which in some ways felt worse. The other students had their groups, their inside jokes, their shared memories from years of growing up together, and Sarah had none of that. She smiled when teachers called on her. She answered correctly. She turned in her homework on time, but none of that earned her a seat at any table that mattered. There was one girl in particular named Madison Clark who seemed to set the tone for how the rest of the class treated people. Madison was not mean in a loud or aggressive way. She was subtle about it, which made her influence harder to challenge. A raised eyebrow, a quiet laugh whispered to a friend, a look passed across the room that everyone understood except the person it was directed at. Madison came from one of the wealthiest families in the area. Her mother drove a white SUV that always looked freshly washed. Madison wore the right things, said the right things, and somehow always managed to be at the center of whatever was happening. Sarah had been at the school for about 6 weeks when the annual Spring Arts Showcase was announced. Every student in the school was encouraged to participate in some way, whether through visual art, drama, writing, or music. The showcase was held in the school's main auditorium, and parents, teachers, and students all attended together. It was considered a big deal, and for many of the more popular students, it was a chance to show off skills they had been practicing for years in private lessons paid for by parents who could afford them. Madison signed up to play the violin. She had been taking lessons since she was 5 years old and was genuinely talented. Several of her close friends signed up as well, forming a small group that rehearsed together during lunch and talked openly about how much they were looking forward to performing. Sarah watched all of this from a distance and said nothing. What almost no one at the school knew was that Sarah had been playing the piano since she was 4 years old. Back in Ohio, her grandmother had an old upright piano in her living room, and Sarah had started picking out melodies on it before she could even read. Her grandmother recognized something in her and began teaching her basic technique. As the years passed, Sarah's ability grew in ways that surprised everyone who heard her play. By the time she was 7, she had moved beyond what her grandmother could teach. And her parents, stretching their budget carefully, found a local teacher named Mr. Vasquez who gave her lessons at a reduced rate because he believed in her gift. When Sarah's family moved to Westfield, one of the hardest parts of the transition was leaving Mr. Vasquez behind. She had not performed publicly in months, but the piano still lived inside her, in her hands and her memory, and the quiet hours she spent practicing on the small keyboard her parents had set up in her bedroom. Music was the one place where Sarah never felt invisible. She signed up for the showcase without telling anyone what she planned to perform. She wrote her name on the list one afternoon while the hallway was mostly empty and walked away without making a thing of it. A few people noticed her name on the sheet, and the word spread in the careless way that gossip does among middle schoolers. Some kids mentioned it in passing. Others made small comments she was not always meant to hear. Madison and her friends laughed quietly about it one afternoon near the lockers, wondering aloud what someone like Sarah could possibly have to offer at a school like theirs. Sarah heard enough to understand what they thought of her. She went home that evening, sat down at her keyboard with her headphones on, and played for 2 hours straight. She was not angry. She was not trying to prove anything to anyone, or at least that is what she told herself. She was simply playing because the music was hers in a way that nothing else in her new life had yet become. The showcase was 10 days away, and Sarah Chen was quietly, carefully, completely ready. The morning of the Spring Arts Showcase arrived with the kind of gray sky that makes everything feel a little heavier than usual. Sarah woke up early, earlier than she needed to, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling for a while before getting up. Her mother had pressed her best blouse the night before and hung it on the back of her bedroom door. Her father had asked twice at dinner whether she needed anything, whether she felt prepared, whether she wanted to run through the piece one more time. She told him she was fine. She meant it. At school, the atmosphere was different from a normal day. Students moved through the hallways with a kind of restless energy that comes before any event that breaks the usual routine. The auditorium doors were open during the afternoon free period, and stagehands from the drama club were arranging chairs and adjusting microphone stands. Teachers moved around with clipboards. The smell of the cafeteria mixed with something that might have been fresh paint from a set piece being finished at the last minute. Sarah moved through all of it quietly. She attended her morning classes, took notes, answered when called upon, and gave no indication that today was any different for her than any other day. But her hands told a different story. Twice during math class, she caught herself moving her fingers under her desk in slow, deliberate patterns, tracing the opening bars of the piece she had chosen to perform. It was something she had done since she was small, a habit so deeply set that she barely noticed it anymore. Her fingers remembered what her mind sometimes tried to overthink. Madison and her group of friends were visibly excited in a way that made their excitement feel like a performance on its own. They gathered near the main hallway bulletin board at lunch, talking over each other about costumes and stage positions and how many family members were coming to watch. Madison was wearing her hair differently, pulled back in a way that suggested she had put thought into how she would look under stage lighting. She laughed easily and often, and the group around her fed off her energy the way they always did. Sarah sat a few tables away in the cafeteria and ate her lunch without rushing. A girl named Priya, who sat near Sarah in English class and had always been politely friendly without ever crossing into actual friendship, stopped beside her tray and asked if she was nervous. Sarah thought about the question honestly before answering. She said she did not think so. Priya smiled and said that was impressive because she herself was terrified and she was only doing a spoken word piece. They talked for a few minutes, longer than they ever had before, and when Priya walked away, Sarah felt something small and warm settle in her chest. It was a good feeling to carry into the afternoon. The showcase was scheduled to begin at 6 in the evening. Parents began arriving at 5:30, filling the rows of the auditorium with the particular noise of a crowd that is happy to be there. Sarah's parents arrived early and found seats in the middle section, close enough to see clearly but not so close that it felt aggressive. Her mother kept her coat folded neatly on her lap. Her father read through the printed program 3 times, though it contained very little information. Sarah's name was listed near the end of the first half, which meant she would perform before the intermission. Backstage, the energy was contained chaos. Students in various states of readiness crowded into the wings and the narrow hallway behind the stage. A teacher named Mr. Elwood was doing his best to keep everyone organized and calm, which was a task that required constant movement and a voice pitched somewhere between firm and encouraging. Some students ran lines quietly with their lips barely moving. Others stood with their eyes closed in what might have been focus or might have been prayer. A girl in a long blue dress kept adjusting the hem and asking anyone nearby whether it looked straight. Madison stood with her violin case open, rosin dust faint on her fingertips as she tightened her bow. She was composed in the way that came from years of performance experience, from recitals and competitions, and an upbringing that treated these moments as natural and expected. She glanced once toward the corner where Sarah was standing alone, hands folded in front of her, watching the organized chaos of the room without participating in it. Something crossed Madison's face, not cruelty exactly, but the particular kind of amusement that comes from not quite taking someone seriously. She turned back to her friends and said something low enough that Sarah could not hear the words, only the laughter that followed. Sarah looked at her hands. She turned them over slowly and looked at her palms, then at her fingers, and then she closed them gently and let them rest at her sides. She was not rattled. She was somewhere inside herself where the noise of the room did not quite reach. In the same quiet place she went every time she sat down at a piano and everything else fell away. The first several acts moved through at a steady pace. 2 students performed a short dramatic scene from a play Sarah did not recognize. A boy played the trumpet with more enthusiasm than precision, but earned warm applause anyway. A group of 4 girls performed a choreographed dance that had clearly taken months of work and received the loudest response of the evening so far. Madison performed toward the middle of the first half and was genuinely impressive, her tone clean and her posture perfect, and the room rewarded her accordingly with strong and sustained applause. Then Mr. Elwood appeared at Sarah's elbow and told her she was next. She nodded once and followed him toward the wings. The stage was bright from where she stood, and the auditorium beyond it was a dark shape filled with the quiet rustling of a few hundred people settling into their seats. She could see the piano at the center of the stage, a full concert grand that the school had rented specifically for the showcase. It was a beautiful instrument, much finer than anything she had ever played on in her life. She heard the principal introduce her name. She heard the polite and minimal applause of an audience that did not yet know who she was. She heard, or imagined she heard, a few sounds from the student section that were not quite applause at all. And then she walked out onto the stage, sat down on the bench, adjusted it by exactly the amount she needed and placed her hands above the keys. The room was quiet. She took one breath, and she began to play. The first notes came out of the piano like something the room had not been expecting and did not quite know how to process. Sarah had chosen to perform the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, but she had chosen it the way a painter chooses a subject, not simply to reproduce it, but to bring something personal to it. The opening was slow and deliberate, the way Beethoven had written it, but under Sarah's hands it had a quality that was harder to name. It was not just technically correct. It was felt deeply and visibly, in the way her shoulders moved slightly with the phrases, and the way her head tilted almost imperceptibly toward the keys when the melody climbed. For the first several seconds, the audience did not respond in any obvious way. There was simply a shift, the kind that happens in a room when something unexpected enters it. People who had been adjusting their programs or checking their phones stopped doing those things. Parents who had been leaning toward each other to whisper something let the thought go unspoken. Teachers standing along the side walls folded their arms and went still. The student section, which had been the source of most of the low-level noise throughout the evening, went quiet in a way it had not been for any other performance. Madison was standing in the wings on the opposite side of the stage with two of her friends. She had her violin case in one hand and had been mid-sentence when Sarah began playing. The sentence never got finished. She turned toward the stage without meaning to, the way you turn toward a sound that your body registers before your mind does. And she stood there looking at the girl she had laughed at just an hour earlier. Sarah did not look at the audience. She never did when she played, not since she was small and her grandmother had told her gently that the music deserved her full attention, and so did the person she was playing for, even if that person was herself. Her eyes moved between the keys and the middle distance, tracking something internal that no one else in the room could see. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with a confidence that had nothing to do with showing off and everything to do with knowing exactly where she was and exactly what she was doing. The piece built slowly the way the sonata is meant to build, the left hand holding the steady rolling triplets beneath the right hand's long singing melody. What Sarah added to it was a quality of breath, of space between the notes that made each one feel chosen rather than inevitable. There were moments where she pulled back the volume to something barely above silence, and the audience leaned forward almost as one body, as though afraid to miss what came next. Then the melody would swell again, and the room would release a tension it had not realized it was holding. About 2 minutes into the performance, a woman in the fourth row put her hand over her mouth. Her husband noticed and looked at her and then looked at the stage, and then he did not look away again. A man near the back who had spent most of the evening with his arms crossed and his attention drifting had straightened in his seat. Several of the younger students in the student section were watching with expressions that were new on their faces, something between confusion and recognition, the look people get when they encounter something that is better than what they thought they were prepared for. Priya, sitting in the middle of the student section, had both hands pressed flat against her knees. She was watching Sarah with an expression of complete and open astonishment. She had sat near this girl in English class for 6 weeks. She had eaten lunch beside her. She had never known. None of them had known. The piece moved through its middle section, the melody deepening, the emotional weight of it shifting in subtle ways that only a player with genuine feeling could navigate. Sarah moved through those shifts the way someone moves through a place they have walked 1,000 times, not thinking about the path but simply being on it. There was a passage near the end of the first movement where the right hand reaches up into the higher register and holds a note over a changing harmony below it. And when Sarah played that passage, the sound it produced in the rented concert grand was so clear and so pure that someone in the audience made a sound without meaning to. A small involuntary exhale that was not quite a gasp but was close to one. She brought the movement to its close with the same care she had brought to its opening, the final notes fading slowly until they dissolved into the silence of the room. And for a moment, a genuine and complete moment, there was nothing. No applause, no rustling, no whispered comments. The auditorium held several hundred people and it was as quiet as an empty room. Then it broke open. The applause started in the parent section and spread instantly through the entire auditorium. Several people stood before they seemed to decide to, rising the way people do when something has moved them past the point of sitting still. The sound was not the polite recognition the audience had given the earlier performers. It was loud and sustained and carried something in it that ordinary applause does not always carry, a kind of release, as though the room had been holding its breath for the last 4 minutes and could finally let it go. Sarah sat at the piano for a moment with her hands resting in her lap. Then she stood, turned toward the audience, and did something small that made several people in the crowd respond even more warmly. She did not bow in a grand or theatrical way. She simply dipped her head once, modestly, the way someone does when they are genuinely grateful rather than performing gratitude. Then she walked off the stage. In the wings, she almost walked directly into Madison, who was standing closer to the stage entrance than Sarah had expected. The two girls looked at each other for a moment. Madison's expression was not what Sarah had anticipated. It was not cold or guarded or searching for something dismissive to land on. It was open in a way that Madison's face did not often appear to be, surprised in a way that had reached past the usual layers she kept between herself and the world. She said one word. She said wow quietly, without any of the performance that usually surrounded the things she said, and then she looked away first. Sarah walked past her toward the back hallway where her things were, and the noise of the auditorium continued to fill the building around her like water filling a room from all directions at once. Sarah found a quiet corner in the back hallway and sat down on a folding chair someone had left against the wall. The sound of the applause had softened to a murmur now as the next act was being introduced, and the hallway had mostly emptied out as other students moved to watch from the wings or returned to their seats in the auditorium. She sat alone for a moment and let the stillness settle around her the way it always did after she played, a particular kind of quiet that felt earned rather than empty. Mr. Elwood appeared around the corner with a look on his face that was several things at once. He was a man who had worked in schools long enough to have seen a great many student performances and had developed a practiced enthusiasm that was genuine but measured. What was on his face now was less measured than usual. He told her that was extraordinary. He used that word specifically and repeated it once as though checking that it still applied, which it did. He asked her how long she had been playing, and when she told him since she was 4 years old, he nodded slowly in the way adults do, when information confirms something they have just witnessed rather than surprising them. The intermission came, and the hallway filled briefly with the organized movement of students, rotating positions, and parents, who had found their way backstage to find their children. Sarah's parents appeared together, her father slightly ahead of her mother, and when they saw her, her mother covered the remaining distance quickly and held her by both shoulders and looked at her face before saying anything. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lighting of the hallway. Her father stood just behind her mother, and when Sarah looked at him, he pressed his lips together and nodded once, and that was enough. She understood everything he meant by it. Other students passed through the hallway during the intermission, and the experience for Sarah was unlike anything she had encountered in her 6 weeks at the school. People who had never spoken to her stopped. Not in an aggressive or overwhelming way, but in the careful manner of someone who wants to say something and is choosing their words because the moment feels like it deserves that care. A boy from her science class, whose name she was fairly certain was Derek, told her that was the most incredible thing he had ever heard live. A girl she did not recognize at all said she had given her chills and pointed to her own arm as evidence. Priya found her near the water fountain and grabbed both of her hands and did not say anything immediately, just held them and shook her head slowly with an expression of fond disbelief that made Sarah laugh for the first time all evening. Madison came toward the end of the intermission. She came alone, without the usual orbit of friends around her, which itself was notable enough that Sarah registered it before Madison had even reached her. She stopped a comfortable distance away, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Madison had the look of someone who had been thinking about what to say for the past 20 minutes and had still not entirely settled on it. She told Sarah she had no idea. She said it plainly and without decoration, just those 4 words, and in the context of everything that had come before them, they carried considerable weight. She was not apologizing exactly, or at least she did not frame it as an apology, but there was something in the directness of it that functioned like one. Sarah looked at her for a moment and then said that most people did not know that she had never really talked about it. Madison nodded. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was honest in the way that pauses between people can be when both of them are aware that something has shifted between them and neither one is quite sure yet what it has shifted into. Before Madison turned to leave, she said one more thing. She said Sarah should have told people, and the way she said it was not a criticism but something closer to its opposite. A kind of acknowledgement that the not knowing had been a loss for the people around her and not just for Sarah. Then she walked back toward her friends and Sarah watched her go. The second half of the showcase passed, and the evening wound down the way these events do, with final applause and a few words from the principal and the slow dispersal of families back into the cool night air of the parking lot. Sarah walked out with her parents, her father's hand briefly on her shoulder as they moved through the doors. The sky that had been gray that morning had cleared during the evening, and the night was cold and sharp with stars visible between the clouds. In the days that followed, things at Westfield Middle School were different for Sarah, not dramatically or all at once, but in the accumulating way that real change tends to move. Priya began saving her a seat at lunch without making a formal announcement of the fact. Mr. Elwood mentioned to the music department head that there was a student he should know about. A few of the students who had spoken to her during intermission continued to speak to her in the hallways, and those small, consistent acknowledgments are the actual material from which belonging is built, slowly and without ceremony. Madison never became her close friend, and Sarah did not expect her to. But something in how Madison carried herself around her changed in a way that others noticed even if they could not name it. The quiet dismissal was gone. In its place was something more neutral and more respectful. And for Sarah, who had not been asking for much more than that, it was enough. What stayed with Sarah most from that evening was not the applause or the changed social landscape or even the look on her parents' faces in the backstage hallway. What stayed was the feeling of sitting down at that beautiful rented piano in front of a room full of strangers, and playing the thing she loved most in the world without apology and without explanation, and having it be, simply and completely, enough. She had not walked onto that stage to make anyone feel anything in particular. She had walked on because the music was hers and had always been hers, through the moves and the transitions and the loneliness and the quiet hours in a small bedroom with headphones on. That was the part no one had laughed at because no one had known it was there. And when it finally stepped into the light, it needed no introduction at all. To the light, it needed no introduction at all. Like, share, and subscribe, don't miss it.